Kingdom of Heaven was released in May 2005 and it was directed by Ridley Scott. Scott's epic, set just before the Third Crusade in 1184, tells the tale of Balian, a moody blacksmith turned paragon of virtue who moves to the barony of Ibelin, located here in modern-day Israel, to inherit his father's titles and seek redemption for his wife's suicide and his murder of a priest. Here he finds fame, fortune, and himself in the bedsheets of a princess married to the heir of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who he promptly whisks away to France when Jerusalem is lost to a jihad led by Saladin. This podcast will ask how successfully and in what ways does the Kingdom of Heaven represent the past? To answer this question, the podcast will be divided into two halves. First, to evaluate if the Kingdom of Heaven offers an effective and accurate depiction of the events and people involved in the period preceding the Third Crusade. To put it simply, if what the film claims happens actually did. The second half will assess why the authors and directors of the Kingdom of Heaven chose to represent history as they did, and if the moral and political messages in the film are relevant to the contemporary debate surrounding the relationship between the West and the Middle East.
We have the Holy Hand Grenade.
Yes, of course! The Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch. 'Tis one of the sacred relics Brother Maynard carries with him. Brother Maynard, bring up the Holy Hand Grenade. 2, 5. Please, sir. 3.
Silly Hollywood special effects such as flaming arrows and exploding trebuchet ammunition aside, the Kingdom of Heaven offers a mixed bag of accurate history and shameless dramatisation, resulting in what Alex von Tunzelmann in an article for The Guardian refers to as a historical C-, a summary I'm inclined to agree with. The Kingdom of Heaven loses history points before it even really begins. While it is true that relative to today, 12th century Europe was repressive and poor, the period is often referred to by historians as the High Middle Ages, not just because it came after the early Middle Ages, but for being a period of rapidly increasing population and great social and political change. According to Hans Hummer, by 1250 the population increase bolstered the European economy to levels that would not be seen again in some areas until the 19th century. It has even been referred to as a 12th century Renaissance. The Kingdom of Heaven, however, portrays Europe in such a way that would lead you to think that Ridley Scott has some kind of grudge against it. He goes as far as to tint almost every scene in France with a grey filter to make it look that much more miserable. Shots in the Holy Land, however, seem to have their contrast set to 10. The colourful scenery is perhaps an effort to justify the Europe bad, Holy Land good narrative that Scott pushes throughout the entire film. Portraying Europe as backwards relative to the Holy Land and the Ayyubid Caliphate under Saladin is not entirely unfair. The intellectual revitalisation of Europe started with the birth of medieval universities. According to Giles Constable and others in Renaissance and Renewal in the 12th century, the spread of these universities was due in large part to increased contact with the Islamic world in Spain and Sicily during the Reconquista and the Byzantine world and the Muslim Levant during the Crusades. This contact allowed Europeans to access scientific Arabic and Greek texts such as the work of Aristotle. It is quite ironic that the intellectual rebirth of Europe was stimulated by religious zeal against the very people who European intellectuals would learn from. Maybe this irony is not lost on Ridley Scott, and that's why he chooses to portray the two areas in such a way. The Kingdom of Heaven stays reasonably true to the general history of the period leading up to the Third Crusade. Events such as the raid of Muslim caravans, the Battle of Hattin, and the surrender of Jerusalem happen in the right order and at the right time. It even manages to include more particular events that were recorded in detail, such as the famous meeting between Reynald de Chatillon, Guy de Lusignan, and Saladin after the Crusader states lost the Battle of Hattin. The decapitation of Reynald at this meeting after he drank water without Saladin's permission is recreated quite faithfully in the film, with primary sources from William of Tyre and Shihab al-Din corroborating this story from both sides of the conflict. The cup scene is, however, one of the only instances of character development in the film that is not a complete fabrication. It is, for example, a wonder there are any scenes in Europe at all in this film, as there's no historical evidence to suggest that the main protagonist Balian was ever even there. As far as historical records show, he spent his whole life in the Holy Land. The real Balian was born to nobility in Ibelin, but perhaps that doesn't have the same dramatic edge to it as the low-born, pure-hearted bastard blacksmith from rural France. The recurring problem with the historical accuracy of the Kingdom of Heaven is its use of characters. The writers and directors appropriate almost every character to suit their needs, Not only is Balian given a totally fictitious backstory to romanticise his zero to hero rise to fortune, he is also playing two people. Balian's brother, Baldwin, is written out of the film by writing his life into Balian's. This may have been a move by the directors to simplify the plot. However, I believe it was done because of Baldwin's involvement in a potential coup that would see him marry Sibylla of Jerusalem. By merging the two brothers into one, Baldwin's potential marriage to Sibylla now plays into Balian's affair with her, adding a little historical authenticity to what would otherwise be total nonsense. Even Balian's affair, that plays such a prominent role in the plot, is only loosely derived from accusations made by William of Tyre, hardly an objective truth. The history of Queen Sibylla suffers in the Kingdom of Heaven. The story of her life is made secondary to that of the male leads, and as an object of Balian's desire, she becomes a periphery to his plot. Sibylla actually died outside Acre in 1190, still dutifully married to Guy de Lusignan. Certainly not in France with Balian. The film, however, has her desperately trying to leave Guy. She scolds Balian for not taking part in a coup, which would have divorced her from him. In reality, Sibylla actually refused to take part in the coup, which would have given her free choice of a new husband. This obviously does not lend itself to the Hollywood romance with Balian, and is conveniently forgotten. Her historically important role is reduced immensely in the film. Bernard Hamilton writes that, had Sibylla lived in more peaceful times, she would have exercised a great deal of power, a significance that is not apparent in the Kingdom of Heaven. While the Kingdom of Heaven offers a reasonable depiction of the period, in terms of events, politics and holy war, it fails in detail. In a desire to make the story of the prelude to the Third Crusade abide by the norms of Hollywood, history is stretched beyond reason, or ignored. As long as you don't take the actions or attitudes of characters seriously, it remains a somewhat informative historical piece. To be fair, the film seems to acknowledge this flaw and tucks away a disclaimer right at the end of the credits. Perhaps they could have done with putting this at the start of the film.
David, when he returned to the White House, he spoke to the media.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
The choices in representing groups such as the Ayyubid Muslims and the Christian Crusaders faced a lot of scrutiny due to the time of its release. Contemporary tension between the Christian West and the Muslim Middle East had been growing since 9/11, when Bush declared his crusade against terrorism. Ridley Scott faces accusations of glossing over the brutality of holy war and counter-holy war. Andrew Sarris in The Observer says, "The righteous rhetoric never stops." The constant harping about religious tolerance after all the carnage witnessed in the film accumulates into what Sarris calls a tower of politically correct jello. Tunzelman too struggles to accept the noble sentiment of almost everyone participating in the crusade. She says the film is hampered by its desire to show that, apart from a few bad apples, Crusaders and Saracens were all moderate, tolerant and jolly reasonable chaps. From a historical standpoint, it is known that while zeal is not the only reason to go on crusade, it was certainly a prime motivating factor. Audiences might find it confusing when people are prepared to sacrifice so much for a religious war they are so apathetic about, particularly after this conversation between Balian and Saladin.
Before I lose it, I will burn it to the ground. Your holy places, ours, every last thing in Jerusalem that drives men mad.
I wonder if it would not be better if you did.
Does anyone really believe that Balian rallied the Christians in Jerusalem by giving a 21st century style speech about the equal religious value of the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Temple of Solomon, as opposed to God wills it, or Deus vult? Dr. Timothy Furnish asks, what purpose does it serve to retroject this kinder and gentler monotheism 800 years into the past and pretend it motivated folks then? Perhaps Ridley Scott, being sensitive to the fragile political climate of the early 2000s, made a conscious choice to tone down the deep cultural and religious divides present in the 12th century, but by doing so, Scott betrays the true history and nature of religious conflict. The film is not totally without a political message with some substance. The venerable way in which Saladin is portrayed, with his secular attitude and pragmatic approach to politics and warfare with the Crusaders, has political overtures, according to Furnish. He believes that the film is implying that the Middle East needs a similar leader today to effectively settle the relationship with the West. Saladin's exploits are another example of the film's woeful ignorance, however. Claims that he let every Christian in Jerusalem walk free after Balian surrendered the city are untrue. Foot soldiers were enslaved. along with 15,000 civilians who could not afford the ransom. While the ransom was low, Saladin was not nearly as benevolent as the film proposes. Scott's desire to appease leaves nobody satisfied and historians rolling their eyes. A rich history of violence and intrigue is softened by the imposition of 21st century Western secular values into a past of intense religious violence. It's not as if this stuff isn't exciting enough to sell tickets. Scott's last big hit before 2005 was Black Hawk Down, a jumble of chaotic battle scenes with little time for character development and deeper plot lines. It was met with better critical acclaim than The Kingdom of Heaven. The injection of love and conspiracy into the series of events aims to keep the viewer engaged in the absence of a sufficiently compelling overarching plot, which is quite an achievement for a film about two civilizations going to war. The lords and ladies of the Crusader states did not lead boring lives. The two lead characters, Balian and Sibylla, have compelling histories full of drama and despair, worthy of an accurate depiction in film. By construing their histories into a 21st century romance, The Kingdom of Heaven is successful in its goal of making people of the 12th century seem a bit like us, and in doing so, alienates those who came to see a historical thriller rather than a chick flick. All this culminates in a story of the 12th century, with everything that is different and interesting about the period chipped away for political and box office reasons. I draw the same conclusion as Tunzelman on The Kingdom of Heaven. The Crusades were never this dull.